Most people hear the phrase lose 1 pound of fat per day and immediately assume it's some kind of miracle trick or extreme shortcut. But the reality is far more practical than it sounds. The human body already has the biological capacity to burn fat at an incredible rate when the right hormonal conditions are in place. Yet most of us never access that potential because our daily habits constantly push us towards storing, not releasing energy. The problem has never been a lack of willpower or a shortage of new diets. It has always been the simple but uncomfortable truth that fat loss depends on addressing the root cause, not the symptoms. When insulin stays high, fat stays locked away, and no amount of calorie counting changes that fundamental law of physiology. But when you finally create the environment where insulin drops and the body is allowed to shift into fat-burning mode, the results can feel almost effortless compared to the struggle you're used to. This isn't about starving yourself or chasing gimmicks. It's about understanding how your body prefers to use fuel and learning to work with it instead of against it. The process is simple, but simple doesn't mean easy because it requires breaking patterns, facing cravings, and stepping away from the constant grazing culture that most people don't even realize is keeping them trapped. The moment you stop feeding the cycle and allow your body to tap into its own stored energy, the fat loss that once felt impossible becomes a predictable, measurable response, not a mystery or a fight you can never win. Fat loss accelerates when insulin levels drop and the body gains access to stored energy. And this single principle explains more success and more frustration than almost anything else in the entire world of weight management. Most people approach fat loss as if it were only a matter of cutting back on calories or exercising more. But the real system running the show is hormonal. When insulin is high, the body is programmed to store energy, not release it. That means even if you eat less, even if you push through a tough workout, the metabolic environment is still tilted toward preservation rather than utilization. Understanding how insulin shapes fat storage is not about diving into complicated biochemistry. It's about recognizing a simple biological rule that governs thousands of decisions your body makes every day. Insulin is a hormone that helps move glucose from the bloodstream into cells, but it also directs the body to store excess energy as fat and keep it there. If insulin rises frequently throughout the day because of constant eating, snacking, or consuming foods that trigger strong insulin responses, your body never gets a chance to tap into its fat reserves. All the energy you need for daily activity is expected to come from the next meal, the next snack, the next sugar hit. And as long as that cycle continues, fat stays locked away. When insulin falls, a completely different metabolic pathway takes over. The body finally shifts from storing mode into release mode. This is when fat becomes accessible, usable, and burnable. It's also the reason some people suddenly experience rapid changes in weight and energy once they adopt habits that lower insulin. They aren't magically burning more calories. They're simply unlocking the massive reservoir of energy they've been carrying for years. Fat is not just stored weight. It's stored fuel. And the average person has tens of thousands of calories stored on their body at any time. When insulin drops low enough, the body begins to use this reserve without hesitation, because biologically that is exactly what it was designed to do. This is how humans survived thousands of years before the availability of constant food. We stored energy when food was available and used it when food was not. Today, we rarely experience the second part of that cycle. But the key point is that the fat-burning machinery is still there, still fully functional, still ready to operate as it always has. The problem is not that the body has forgotten how to burn fat. The problem is that the modern environment keeps insulin elevated so often that fat burning never gets the green light. When insulin stays low for sustained periods, the body doesn't need to wait days or weeks to begin burning fat. It responds within hours because hormonally it recognizes the shift immediately. People often think fat loss is slow by nature, but physiologically it can be remarkably fast once the metabolic switch is flipped. What slows it down is not biology, but interference. Constant eating, processed foods that provoke high insulin responses, stress that influences glucose and insulin dynamics, and habits that train the body to expect external fuel instead of using its own. Fat loss in its purest form is a process of hormonal permission. When insulin levels fall, that permission is granted. The moment insulin rises again, the door closes. This is why someone can eat a seemingly small snack and unknowingly interrupt hours of fat burning. Even a tiny insulin spike can signal the body to stop accessing stored fat and return to burning the incoming food first. It's not the size of the snack that matters. It's the hormonal reaction. This is also why people who space their meals out or adopt fasting windows see results even without drastically changing what they eat. They give their body long enough insulin breaks to resume its natural fat-burning rhythm. The simplicity of this process often surprises people because it feels too obvious, too basic, too straightforward compared to the complicated diet plans and calorie charts they've been taught to follow. But biology doesn't operate according to diet trends. It follows the hormonal signals it was built to respond to. Lowering insulin doesn't require extreme restriction. It doesn't require starving yourself. It doesn't require expensive products or strict meal plans or elaborate systems. It simply requires allowing the body uninterrupted time without food so insulin can fall. This could mean no snacking between meals, extending the gap between dinner and breakfast, or implementing structured fasting windows that align with your lifestyle. The specifics vary from person to person, but the principle remains constant. Once insulin is low enough for long enough, the body naturally turns to stored fat. That is when people begin to experience the energy, clarity, and momentum that come from burning their own fuel rather than depending entirely on external sources. Fat becomes the body's preferred energy source in a low insulin environment. It supplies steady, sustained energy without the highs and crashes associated with glucose-heavy eating patterns. People often describe feeling lighter or clearer when they shift into fat burning, not because the weight instantly disappears, but because their energy is no longer held hostage by constant carbohydrate cycling. When insulin stops dictating the rhythm of energy storage, the body finds a more stable pace, one that feels natural and steady. This is the environment where someone could lose a pound of fat per day under the right metabolic conditions, not because of a trick or a promise, but because the body finally has consistent access to its own fuel instead of being blocked by hormonal barriers. The idea that fat loss accelerates when insulin drops is not a motivational slogan. It's a reflection of the oldest survival system the human body has. The challenge today is not understanding the system, but learning to get out of its way. Modern eating patterns constantly push insulin up, preventing the very process people desperately want to achieve. When you start to break that cycle, meal by meal, hour by hour, your body begins shifting back to the metabolic pattern it was designed for. The one where stored fat is not an emergency reserve, but readily available energy source the moment insulin finally steps aside. The 1 pound per day idea reflects potential, not a promise, and depends entirely on metabolic conditions. And understanding this difference is crucial, because most people hear such a claim and immediately assume it refers to a guaranteed outcome rather than a physiological possibility. The body has remarkable capacity to mobilize and burn stored fat under the right hormonal environment, and in certain situations, the rate of fat loss can be surprisingly rapid. But this potential does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by insulin levels, meal timing, stress hormones, sleep quality, activity patterns, and the broader metabolic state that has been built over months and years. The idea that someone can lose a pound of fat per day is not meant to be interpreted as a standard expectation. It represents what becomes possible when stored fat becomes a primary fuel source and the body finally has uninterrupted access to the energy it has been holding on to. Fat loss at high speeds is simply a reflection of the body operating with fewer obstacles, fewer hormonal interruptions, and fewer external fuel inputs, forcing it to switch back to storing mode. When insulin levels remain low for extended periods, the body transitions into using its own fat stores at a consistent rate. Since a pound of fat contains roughly 3,500 to 4,000 calories, burning that much in a single day would require a substantial energy shift that typically does not occur when a person is consuming multiple meals, snacks, and glucose-based foods throughout the day. But during fasting windows or prolonged period without food, insulin drops far enough for the body to access fat continuously. This is why individuals in well-structured fasting routines sometimes see dramatic short-term changes on the scale. The weight loss is not magic. It is simply the result of the body tapping into its own reserves with far fewer interruptions. However, this process is highly dependent on how elevated a person's insulin and glucose levels have been historically. Someone who has struggled with insulin resistance for years may require longer or more consistent fasting windows to reach the same state. Another person with healthier metabolic function might enter fat-burning mode more quickly. The phrase simple but not easy fits perfectly here because the biology behind the process is straightforward. Create an environment where insulin stays low and fat becomes accessible, and the body will naturally increase its fat-burning rate. But the daily practice of creating and maintaining that environment often requires breaking long-standing habits tied to emotional, psychological, and cultural cues. People are used to eating in response to the clock, cravings, boredom, stress, or social expectations, not necessarily hunger. Each time food is consumed, insulin rises, even with relatively small snacks, and the fat-burning process shuts down. So, the gap between meals becomes just as important as the meals themselves. Extending that gap is what creates the metabolic conditions where rapid fat loss becomes possible. But extending that gap is not always easy, especially for someone accustomed to constant intake, or someone who relies heavily on processed carbohydrates that trigger hunger cycles. This is why the potential of losing a pound of fat per day should always be framed as a reflection of metabolic access, rather than a target to chase. The body burns fat at the speed that aligns with its hormonal environment, not the speed someone desires. When the environment is right, fat burning increases without force, without strain, without feeling like an uphill battle. This is also why people often describe fasting-fueled fat loss as smoother or more stable than traditional dieting. When insulin remains consistently low, the body does not abruptly switch between energy sources. It stays in fat-burning mode for long stretches, drawing from stored reserves the way it was designed during periods without food. But the moment insulin rises, the body pauses that process. A single snack can reset the hormonal signal for hours, which is why people often fail to see results despite eating fewer calories overall. They interrupt the hormonal sequence that allows rapid fat loss to occur. Metabolic conditions also involve more than just eating patterns. Stress plays a significant role because stress hormones drive glucose release, which in turn influences insulin. Sleep disruption affects hunger hormones and insulin sensitivity. Sedentary routines reduce the body's ability to mobilize stored fat. Even hydration can influence how smoothly fasting transitions occur. All these factors determine whether the hormonal environment is conducive to fast fat burning or resistant to it. Someone may follow the same fasting window as another person, but see slower results if stress is high or sleep is consistently poor. This doesn't mean the process is failing. It means the body is responding according to the signals it receives. The potential for rapid fat loss exists in nearly everyone, but the degree to which it is realized depends on how aligned their internal signals are with fat-burning physiology. The idea of losing a pound per day also tends to create unrealistic expectations when taken literally. People imagine dramatic internal combustion happening around the clock, as if the body burns fat in a linear, predictable pattern. In reality, fat loss is dynamic. Some days are higher, some lower, and not all scale weight reflects fat. Water shifts, glycogen depletion, sodium intake, hormonal changes, and digestive patterns all contribute to daily fluctuations. It is entirely possible for someone to lose a pound of fat while the scale remains unchanged because water retention masks the fat loss. It's also possible to lose more scale weight than actual fat due to water and glycogen shifts early in fasting periods. So the phrase should be seen as a representation of what the body can do under optimal conditions, not a daily measurement tool. When understood correctly, the concept becomes empowering rather than misleading. It shows that the body is capable of far more than most people realize. It highlights the difference between a body trapped in storage mode and a body finally allowed to use its own energy. It reframes fat loss from a slow grind to a process governed by metabolic logic. And most importantly, it makes clear that fat loss rates are not measures of effort or discipline, but signals of whether the hormonal environment is aligned with the body's natural design. The real goal is not to chase a pound per day, but to create the conditions that make that level of fat access possible. Because once the body is consistently operating in that state, fat loss stops feeling like a battle and starts feeling like a system finally working the way it was always meant to work. Frequent snacking keeps the body in storage mode and blocks natural fat burning. And this single habit, more than almost any other, explains why so many people struggle to lose weight, even when they believe they're eating healthy or consuming fewer calories. Snacking seems harmless, even encouraged by popular diet culture, which often repeats the idea that eating every couple of hours boosts metabolism or prevents hunger. But physiologically, every time food enters the body, the same sequence unfolds. Glucose rises, insulin rises, and the body shifts from using stored energy to using the incoming fuel. Insulin does not care whether the snack was small or large. Its job is to manage incoming nutrients. And when it rises, fat burning shuts down. This is why even a small handful of nuts, a protein bar, a piece of fruit, or a so-called healthy smoothie can stall fat loss for hours. The interruption is not about the size of the snack. It is about the hormonal response it triggers. If someone is eating 5 or 6 times a day, even if the total calories remain modest, insulin rarely falls enough to allow the body to access its fat stores. The idea of snacking as a normal daily behavior is relatively new. Historically, people ate 1, 2, or sometimes 3 meals depending on culture, lifestyle, or availability of food. The constant grazing pattern emerged largely from modern food marketing, processed food availability, and a belief that appetite must be managed by continuous intake. The body was never designed for endless feeding cycles. Humans evolved with periods of eating and periods of fasting built into their lifestyle, not by choice, but by necessity. During fasting periods, insulin stayed low and fat was used as energy. During eating periods, insulin rose and energy was stored. When snacking fills in the gaps between meals, that natural cycle becomes impossible. Fat burning requires uninterrupted time without incoming food, and snacking removes those windows. The result is a metabolic state where the body is always waiting for the next external fuel source, rather than accessing the abundant internal fuel stored in adipose tissue. Many people who struggle with hunger or cravings assume these signals mean the body needs food. But frequent snacking often creates the very hunger patterns people are trying to avoid. When insulin rises repeatedly throughout the day, glucose drops more sharply afterward, leading to sudden hunger, irritability, or cravings for quick carbohydrates. This cycle trains the body to depend on constant feeding. It is not true hunger, but a hormonal rhythm shaped by the timing of food intake. Breaking the snacking habit resets this rhythm. When meals are spaced out and insulin is allowed to fall, hunger signals become more stable, cravings diminish, and the body becomes comfortable drawing on its own fat stores between meals. People often discover that their appetite becomes quieter, not louder, when they stop snacking. But this shift only occurs once the body has had enough time to relearn how to use its internal fuel. Snacking also encourages mindless eating. People snack while working, driving, watching TV, or dealing with stress, often without awareness of the quantity consumed or the frequency of intake. Each of those mindless bites is another insulin spike, another interruption of fat burning, another reset of the metabolic clock. Even healthy foods consumed in this pattern produce the same effect. The body never gets a break. It becomes trapped in a hormonal loop where fat storage is constantly reinforced and fat release is constantly blocked. This is why someone may eat a clean diet and still see little progress. The problem is not the quality of food, but the timing. The body cannot burn fat effectively if it never has to reach for it, because food is always coming in. Snacking creates an energy environment where storage becomes a default state. The cultural acceptance of snacking is so deeply rooted that many people don't realize how often they're actually eating. A splash of milk in coffee, a few bites while cooking, a piece of candy from a desk jar, a late-night nibble. All of these count as food events that trigger hormonal activity. The body doesn't distinguish between a meal and a bite. It responds to nutrients entering the digestive system. That means someone aiming for fat loss might believe they're fasting between meals, but unknowingly interrupting that fast several times a day. True fat burning happens only when insulin falls low enough and long enough for the body to shift fuel sources. Snacking delays or prevents this shift. It creates metabolic noise that keeps the system busy managing the newest intake instead of clearing stored energy. When people stop snacking, several changes begin to unfold even before significant fat loss occurs. Energy levels stabilize because the body stops depending on glucose highs and lows. Mental clarity improves because the brain receives a steady supply of ketone bodies and fatty acids instead of fluctuating glucose levels. Hunger signals become more predictable and less urgent, revealing that much of what felt like hunger before was actually insulin-driven demand for another hit of food. These changes set the stage for meaningful fat loss because the body finally begins operating in a rhythm aligned with its design. Instead of constantly firing insulin and storing energy, it alternates between storing and burning in a healthy cycle. With fewer spikes, insulin sensitivity improves, cravings calm, and metabolism becomes more responsive. Snacking also affects weight loss psychologically. Frequent eating creates the sense that food must always be nearby, that the body cannot comfortably go for hours without intake. This belief feeds anxiety around hunger and reinforces emotional dependence on food. It also makes fasting or meal spacing seem harder than it is. When someone breaks the snacking cycle, they begin to relearn the natural arc of hunger, a gentle rise, a plateau, and a decline if no food is consumed. Hunger waves pass. They do not intensify endlessly. The body waits for the next meal without panic because it knows how to access stored fuel. This single realization can transform a person's relationship with food. The body becomes an ally instead of a constant negotiator, demanding feeding every 2 or 3 hours. The impact of eliminating snacking extends far beyond calorie control. It fundamentally alters the hormonal environment of the body. Fat loss becomes a natural consequence of consistent, extended periods of low insulin. Meals become more satisfying because hunger has time to build. Cravings lose their power because the hormonal triggers weaken. And most importantly, the body regains the ability to burn fat steadily throughout the day. The simplicity of the strategy, eat fewer times, stop grazing, allow insulin to fall, might seem too easy compared to complicated diet plans people are used to. But the physiology behind it is powerful. Once snacking stops, the body finally gets the space it needs to shift out of storage mode and into the state of fat release that many people have been trying to achieve for years without realizing the biggest obstacle was a harmless-looking snack scattered throughout their day. Extended fasting windows improve hormonal balance and support rapid fat utilization. And this concept becomes clearer when you understand that the body's metabolic state is shaped not just by what you eat, but by when you eat. Most people focus on food quality, macronutrients, or calorie counts, yet overlook the powerful influence of time. The hours without food, those quiet metabolic gaps, are where some of the most transformative changes happen. When you extend the fasting window, you give insulin the time it needs to fall. And once insulin falls, the cellular environment shifts in a way that finally allows stored fat to be accessed. This shift is not subtle. It is profound. It marks the transition from a body dependent on external fuel sources to one capable of relying on its own reserves. People often assume fasting means deprivation, but biologically fasting is a signal, a cue that triggers the body to switch fuel systems, rebalance hormones, improve sensitivity, and begin using stored energy with remarkable efficiency. During extended fasting windows, insulin gradually declines from its baseline levels. Because insulin acts as a primary brake on fat burning, its reduction opens a metabolic door to fat mobilization. The drop in insulin doesn't happen instantly after a meal. It takes hours. This is why meal timing is just as important as meal content. When the gap between meals is too short, insulin never falls low enough for the body to begin tapping into fat stores. But extend that gap 14 hours, 16 hours, 18 hours or more, and the metabolic conditions change dramatically. Glycogen stores slowly deplete, glucose levels stabilize, and the body begins shifting toward fat oxidation. This shift brings a sense of steady energy because fat provides a cleaner, more sustained fuel source than rapid glucose spikes. Many people describe how, after the initial adjustment period, the sense of hunger they expected to intensify actually fades, replaced by a calmer, more stable rhythm. Extended fasting also impacts other hormones that influence fat loss, such as growth hormone. Growth hormone levels rise during fasting, supporting fat utilization while helping preserve lean mass. This hormonal response makes fasting different from simple calorie restriction. When someone merely eats less food but continues eating frequently, insulin may still remain elevated and growth hormone may not reach its fasting-enhanced levels. As a result, fat burning remains sluggish and muscle preservation becomes harder. But during extended fasting, growth hormone supports the body by maintaining tissue while unlocking stored energy. This creates a metabolic environment where fat becomes a primary fuel, not muscle, and the body begins drawing from long-term energy reserves more efficiently. Another crucial part of extended fasting windows is their impact on insulin sensitivity. Most people living with constant eating patterns experience some degree of impaired insulin sensitivity, meaning their cells don't respond to insulin as effectively as they used to. This leads the body to release even more insulin to manage incoming glucose, creating a loop that keeps insulin chronically high. Extended fasting breaks this loop. With fewer insulin spikes, cells begin to respond more effectively, requiring less insulin to handle the same amount of glucose. Improved insulin sensitivity means the body becomes more capable of switching between fuel sources and less prone to storing excess energy as fat. This is why extended fasting is often associated with accelerated fat loss even when total calorie intake remains relatively unchanged. Extended fasting windows also allow the body to enter deeper metabolic states, such as ketosis, where fat becomes the dominant fuel source. Ketosis is not something the body enters only through low-carb diets. Fasting naturally triggers it because the absence of incoming food forces the body to shift to internal energy stores. When this shift happens consistently, the body becomes metabolically flexible, easily alternating between glucose and fat depending on availability. This flexibility is what enables rapid fat utilization, especially when fasting windows are long enough. Once fat becomes a preferred fuel, people often notice mental clarity, stable energy, reduced cravings, and a sense of lightness that is hard to replicate through constant eating patterns. This isn't due to willpower or discipline. It is simply the body functioning in a state it was biologically built to experience. Another benefit of extended fasting windows is a reduction of appetite dysregulation. People who snack frequently or eat from morning to night often find their hunger signals confused or overly intense. The body becomes accustomed to frequent spikes in glucose and insulin, creating cycles of hunger that are not true hunger, but merely conditioned responses. Extended fasting disrupts this cycle. When the body realizes that food is not coming every few hours, it begins to regulate hunger differently. Ghrelin, the hormone that signals hunger, begins to follow a natural rhythm rather than reacting to conditioned eating patterns. This leads to fewer cravings, less emotional eating, and a more predictable appetite. Many people discover that fasting does not make them hungrier in the long run. It makes hunger more manageable, more stable, and less demanding. Extended fasting windows also support cellular repair processes that indirectly influence fat loss. When the body is not constantly digesting food, it can focus on internal housekeeping tasks such as clearing damaged cells, reducing inflammation, and improving mitochondrial function. Healthier cells burn energy more efficiently. Better mitochondrial function means the body uses fat more effectively. Reduced inflammation improves hormone signaling and metabolic responsiveness. These internal improvements may not be visible immediately, but they form a foundation for steady fat loss and better metabolic health over time. Perhaps one of the most overlooked benefits of extended fasting windows is psychological clarity. When someone eats frequently, they spend a surprising amount of time thinking about food, what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat. Fasting removes this constant mental noise. With fewer meals, fewer decisions, and fewer cravings, the mind becomes freer, calmer. The reduction in food preoccupation helps people stay consistent with their goals. It reduces emotional eating and breaks the habit loops tied to reward-based snacking. The discipline required to maintain extended fasting windows becomes easier over time because the body adapts and the psychological burden lightens. As hunger stabilizes and energy increases, fasting begins to feel natural rather than forced. Extended fasting windows are simple in concept but transformative in effect. They allow insulin to fall, fat to become available, hormones to rebalance, metabolism to become flexible, appetite to stabilize, and the body to operate as it was originally designed. This simplicity is often misunderstood in a world that prefers complicated diet rules. But the body does not need complexity to lose fat. It needs uninterrupted time. When given those windows, fat burning accelerates in a way that surprises people who have spent years counting calories, fighting hunger, and wondering why the scale barely moves. The key is not starving the body, but allowing it the space and time to use what is already stored. Calories matter less than the hormonal environment controlling whether fat is stored or released. And this idea challenges one of the most deeply ingrained beliefs in modern dieting. For decades, people have been taught that weight loss is nothing more than a math problem. Eat fewer calories than you burn, and the body will automatically dip into its fat stores. But the body is not a calculator. It is a hormonal system driven by complex signals that determine whether those calories are burned, stored, or reserved for later. Two people can eat the same number of calories and experience completely different outcomes, not because of discipline or willpower, but because their hormonal environments are different. When insulin is high, calories are directed towards storage, especially as fat. When insulin is low, the same calories can be used as energy or even burned off quickly. This hormonal control is why calorie counting alone fails so many people who follow it with intention and discipline. The most influential hormone in this equation is insulin. Insulin decides whether fat cells open or close, whether energy is stored or released, whether the body runs on glucose or taps into its fat reserves. Someone with chronically elevated insulin can reduce calories, skip desserts, avoid junk food, and still see minimal fat loss because the body is metabolically blocked from accessing stored energy. Even if they eat less, the body compensates by slowing metabolism, increasing hunger, and conserving energy. This creates a familiar dieting cycle. Initial weight loss followed by a plateau followed by exhaustion and rebound eating. It's not failure, it's hormonal resistance. The body is protecting itself because it perceives a low-calorie intake as a threat rather than an opportunity to burn fat. Meanwhile, another person can eat the same amount or even more, but because their insulin remains low between meals, their body freely taps into stored fat and their metabolism stays active. This distinction becomes even clearer when looking at people with insulin resistance. Insulin resistance means that the cells are less responsive to insulin, so the body releases even more insulin to compensate. That means fat cells stay locked for longer periods, even if total calories are reduced. High insulin prevents stored fat from being accessible. This is why someone can gain weight even while dieting or eating modest portions. The issue isn't calorie quantity, it's hormonal permission. When the body cannot access fat because insulin remains elevated, it compensates by signaling hunger, fatigue, or cravings in an attempt to acquire fast glucose-based energy. This creates the illusion of lack of willpower, when in reality, the body is simply responding to the hormonal state it is trapped in. Until insulin falls, fat burning remains nearly impossible no matter how few calories are consumed. The opposite is also true. When insulin stays low, even a moderate calorie intake can result in fat burning because the body continues using stored energy between meals. Low insulin creates metabolic flexibility, meaning the body can switch between using food energy and stored fat as needed. This flexibility keeps metabolism robust, stabilizes appetite, and reduces cravings. It's why people who practice fasting or time-restricted eating often find fat loss easier and more predictable. They aren't necessarily eating fewer calories. They are eating within a hormonal environment that favors fat release. This environment matters more than the absolute number of calories consumed because hormones determine where those calories go. Do they go into muscle, into daily energy use, or do they get tucked away into fat cells? Insulin answers that question every time food enters the body. Another reason calories matter less than hormonal balance is that the body adjusts its energy expenditure based on hormonal cues, not calorie intake. When insulin is high and calories are restricted, the body senses scarcity and slows metabolism to conserve energy. People feel colder, more tired, more irritable, and less motivated to move. The body is trying to survive. Fat burning decreases because a hormonal signal suggests storing energy rather than releasing it. Meanwhile, when insulin is low and fasting windows allow the body to rely on fat stores, metabolism often stays stable or even increases. The body is not threatened because it has access to a massive supply of stored energy. This stability prevents the metabolic slowdown that makes traditional dieting so difficult. The hormonal state determines metabolic speed, not calorie numbers alone. Hunger is also hormonally regulated, not calorie regulated. Two meals with identical calories can have entirely different effects on hunger depending on their impact on insulin. A high-carb, insulin-spiking meal can trigger hunger soon after eating, even if the meal contained enough calories for several hours of energy. A low-insulin meal or a fasting window can produce hours of satiety even with fewer calories. This is because hormones like ghrelin, leptin, insulin, and peptide YY shape the sensation of hunger more than caloric intake. People who rely on calorie restriction often feel hungry all the time because the hormonal environment never shifts in their favor. In contrast, people who reduce eating frequency or extend fasting windows often feel less hungry despite consuming fewer calories naturally. The difference is hormonal alignment. The quality and timing of food matter because they influence hormones, and hormones determine whether calories lead to fat storage or fat burning. Eating frequently, even small snacks, keeps insulin elevated and prevents fat burning. Eating within a compressed window allows insulin to fall and fat burning to begin. Eating processed carbohydrates creates strong insulin responses that encourage fat storage, while whole foods, proteins, and fats create lower insulin responses that allow the body to access stored fat more easily. These are hormonal effects, not calorie effects. Someone may consume a high-calorie meal and still lose fat if insulin remains low afterward, and the fasting window that follows allows the body to burn stored energy. Someone else may eat fewer calories but snack throughout the day and gain fat because insulin never drops far enough to unlock stored energy. This is why focusing solely on calories leads to frustration. Calories describe the energy content of food, but hormones describe how the body uses that energy. Without understanding hormones, calorie reduction becomes a blind strategy with unpredictable results. Hormonal balance determines whether fat is stored, burned, or held in reserve. Hormonal balance determines hunger, metabolism, and cravings. Hormonal balance determines whether the body feels safe accessing its fat stores or whether it clings to them. When the hormonal environment is optimized, primarily by lowering insulin through reduced eating frequency and extended fasting windows, the body naturally begins to burn fat at a faster, more stable rate. Fat loss becomes a physiological response, not a willpower battle. This is the reason calories matter less than the hormonal environment. Hormones decide what the body does with calories, not the calories themselves. The idea that cravings are simply a failure of discipline is one of the biggest misconceptions people carry into their fat loss journey. When someone says they lack willpower, what they're really describing is a battle happening inside their hormonal system, a series of biochemical signals pushing them toward food, even when a rational mind is trying to pull away. Cravings are not random or a sign of weakness. They are physiological messages shaped by insulin levels, hunger hormones, stress hormones, sleep quality, and the body's overall energy state. When someone begins a fat loss strategy, especially one that reduces meal frequency or extends fasting windows, these hormonal signals often intensify, not because the body is breaking down, but because it is transitioning. Understanding why these cravings happen removes the shame around them and empowers a person to respond intelligently rather than react impulsively. The starting point is recognizing that hunger itself comes in waves, and cravings are not the same as true hunger. Hunger is a physical sensation tied to low energy in the bloodstream, while cravings are urges shaped by habitual eating patterns, dopamine pathways, and conditioned responses. When someone is used to eating every 2 to 3 hours, the body anticipates those meals and releases hormones like ghrelin on schedule, not because energy is actually low, but because the brain is trained to expect food. This means many cravings occur simply because the clock hits a certain hour. When a person begins fasting longer or eating less frequently, these scheduled hormonal spikes continue for a few days before gradually fading. This is why the first period of lifestyle change feels difficult. It is not a lack of discipline, but a biological adjustment that needs time to recalibrate. Insulin plays a major role in these signals. When insulin is elevated, fat cells are locked and the body cannot access stored energy effectively. So even if there is plenty of stored fat available, the body feels as though no fuel is accessible, leading to cravings as a survival mechanism. When someone eats processed carbs or sugars frequently, insulin stays high for longer periods, creating a state where the body constantly feels deprived of energy despite having abundant fat reserves. This mismatch between stored energy and accessible energy creates powerful cravings, especially for fast-burning carbohydrates that can quickly raise blood sugar. The person then eats again, insulin rises again, and the cycle continues. When fasting breaks this pattern and insulin levels fall, the body slowly shifts back into a state where fat becomes available for fuel. But that shift is not instant. During the transition, the body may still send cravings because it hasn't fully adapted to mobilizing stored fat efficiently yet. Stress amplifies this even more. Cortisol, the stress hormone, increases appetite and encourages the body to seek high-energy foods because it interprets stress as a threat that requires quick fuel. When someone experiences daily stress from work, relationships, or lack of sleep, the body continually pushes toward comfort foods. Many people interpret this as emotional eating or weak discipline, but it is actually a hormonal reaction to perceived danger. When cortisol is high and insulin is elevated at the same time, cravings become nearly impossible to resist because two powerful hormonal systems are working together to push the body toward immediate calories. Sleep further complicates this hormonal landscape. Even one night of poor sleep increases ghrelin, the hormone that stimulates hunger, and decreases leptin, the hormone that signals fullness. The result is that cravings intensify the following day, especially for sugary and fatty foods. People often assume this is a psychological response to feeling tired, but it is a measurable hormonal shift that physically drives appetite upward. When someone is trying to lose fat and sleep is inconsistent, cravings become a daily challenge, not because the person lacks commitment, but because their internal chemistry is working against them. Improving sleep quality often reduces cravings without any change in diet simply because hormones stabilize. Habit formation also plays a significant role. The brain releases dopamine when eating highly palatable foods, particularly those high in sugar and fat. Over time, even thinking about these foods triggers dopamine release, creating a feedback loop where cravings become tied to emotional states, environments, and routines. This is why someone might crave something sweet after dinner, even if they are physically full. The brain has learned to associate dessert with reward. When attempting to break this pattern, the cravings often feel intense, not because the body needs the food, but because the brain is seeking the dopamine reward it has grown accustomed to receiving. Breaking these patterns requires consistency, not perfection. Each time a craving passes without being acted on, the brain weakens that pathway slightly, and over weeks, the conditioned response fades. When people begin fasting or reducing meal frequency, the misunderstanding of cravings becomes one of the biggest obstacles. They assume cravings mean the approach is wrong, or their body is suffering, or they are doing something unsafe. In reality, cravings are often a sign that the body is shifting from sugar dependence to fat fuel, adjusting hormonal timing, recalibrating appetite signals, and breaking conditioned pathways built over years. This process is uncomfortable at times, but it is temporary. Once insulin stabilizes and the body becomes better at accessing stored fat, cravings drop dramatically. People often report that they feel more in control, not because they suddenly gained willpower, but because the hormonal noise decreased. Managing cravings is not about fighting harder, but about creating an environment where the body does not need to shout for energy. Stable insulin, fewer spikes in blood sugar, consistent fasting windows, quality sleep, stress management, and breaking habitual eating patterns all create a foundation where cravings naturally diminish. The body stops sending urgent signals once it trusts that energy is available, and fat becomes accessible as a stable fuel source. Understanding cravings as hormonal signals removes the stigma and gives people a pathway to navigate them with confidence rather than frustration. Cravings often feel like sudden waves of weakness, moments where the body seems to demand food with an intensity that feels almost uncontrollable. But these urges are not failures of character or lapses in discipline. They are biochemical signals shaped by the body's internal environment. When someone understands this, everything about fat loss becomes less personal and more predictable. Cravings are messages, not moral judgments, and they arise from hormonal fluctuations that can be explained, anticipated, and managed over time. When a craving hits, what is actually happening is a conversation between hormones like insulin, ghrelin, cortisol, and dopamine, all of which influence appetite, energy regulation, and emotional responses to food. Many people mistake cravings for hunger, but the two are very different experiences. Hunger is a natural physical state that builds gradually, often accompanied by sensations such as stomach emptiness or a drop in energy. Cravings, on the other hand, are sharper and more specific. A person rarely craves broccoli when craving hits. Instead, the desire is often for sugar, carbs, or foods associated with comfort and quick energy. These cravings emerge because the body interprets certain internal cues as signals that it should reach for fast-access fuel. When insulin levels remain elevated for long periods due to frequent snacking or high-carb eating patterns, fat stores stay locked away, making the body think it does not have immediate access to energy. As a result, cravings arise as a survival mechanism, urging the person to eat something that provides quick glucose. When someone begins practicing intermittent fasting or reduces eating frequency, these cravings often intensify at first, not because the approach is harmful, but because the body is transitioning. It is used to receiving a steady stream of food, and the hormonal rhythm of ghrelin, often called a hunger hormone, has been trained to rise around habitual meal times. If a person always snacks at night, ghrelin will spike in the evening whether or not the body truly needs food. In this adaptation phase, cravings can feel like a signal that something is wrong, when in reality, it shows that the body is recalibrating its timing and adjusting to longer windows without food. Over days or weeks, as the hormonal schedule shifts, these spikes fade and cravings become far less frequent. Stress adds another layer to the craving process. Cortisol, the stress hormone, increases appetite and especially increases the desire for high-energy foods. When cortisol rises due to work pressure, emotional strain, or lack of sleep, the body interprets this stress as a threat. Even if the threat is not physical, the evolutionary response is to seek quick fuel because the body wants to prepare for action. This is why stressful days often end with reaching for sweets or carbs, even when a person rationally knows they don't need them. Understanding that this urge is hormonal allows someone to recognize it without internalizing guilt. It becomes clear that the craving is a chemical attempt to cope with stress rather than a sign of weakness or lack of dedication. Sleep quality strongly influences cravings as well. A single night of poor sleep can push appetite-regulating hormones out of balance. Ghrelin increases, making the body feel hungrier, while leptin, the hormone that signals fullness, drops. As a result, the body becomes more sensitive to food cues and more reactive to tempting foods. Studies consistently show that people who sleep less are more likely to experience cravings for sugary, high-calorie foods the next day. Again, this is not a psychological flaw. It is a direct hormonal response to fatigue. When sleep becomes consistent, cravings decrease naturally because the body no longer compensates for energy lost through additional food intake. Dopamine has one of the strongest influences on cravings. Highly palatable foods, such as sweets, pastries, fast food, and processed snacks trigger dopamine release, creating a reward pathway in the brain. Over time, this pathway becomes conditioned. The brain begins to crave not the food itself, but the dopamine response associated with it. This is why cravings often occur in predictable emotional situations or at specific times of day. The body has learned that these foods provide quick emotional relief or pleasure. When a person tries to break this pattern, cravings initially surge because the brain expects a reward. But every time the craving passes without being satisfied, the brain begins to weaken that old pathway. Over weeks or months, the cycle loses power and cravings diminish. Not because the person becomes stronger, but because the brain stops demanding the dopamine hit. One of the most important realizations is that cravings follow patterns. They rise and fall in waves, often lasting only minutes. If a person waits, drinks water, moves around, or shifts focus, the craving naturally subsides because a hormonal signal passes. With time, as insulin stabilizes and the body becomes more efficient at burning stored fat, cravings lose much of their intensity. When fat becomes a steady fuel source, the body no longer panics when food is not immediately available. Its messages become calmer and more stable. This is why people who consistently practice fasting often report that cravings fade dramatically after a few weeks. Their internal chemistry has changed, and the body trusts that energy is accessible even without constant eating. Cravings are therefore signals of imbalance rather than indicators of personal failure. They reveal where hormonal rhythms need adjustment, whether the body is relying too heavily on glucose or energy, whether stress levels are too high, or whether sleep quality needs improvement. When a person understands this, they stop fighting cravings with guilt and begin responding to them with strategy. Fat loss becomes smoother because the person learns to anticipate cravings, manage them, and gradually reduce their frequency by improving the underlying hormonal environment. Consistency is the quiet force that turns fat loss from something unpredictable into something almost mechanical. People often search for the perfect diet, the perfect schedule, or the perfect method. But the real transformation happens when a person creates a rhythm the body can rely on. The human body functions best when it knows what to expect. It adapts to patterns more than instructions. This is why some people see rapid progress, while others struggle despite using similar strategies. It is not the method alone that determines success, but the consistency with which that method is applied. When eating windows, fasting periods, meal frequency, and food choices follow a stable pattern, the hormonal environment shifts in ways that support effortless fat loss. But when these patterns fluctuate day to day, the body remains in a state of confusion, never fully switching to sustained fat-burning mode. The body's hormonal system is deeply influenced by routine. Insulin, hunger hormones, cortisol, and metabolic signals all synchronize around patterns that repeat. For example, if someone practices time-restricted eating, the body gradually adapts so that hunger hormones decline outside the eating window and rise only near expected meal times. But if that window constantly shifts, one day eating breakfast early, the next skipping it, another day eating late at night, the hormonal rhythm never stabilizes, hunger signals become unpredictable, cravings remain strong, and the body continues to rely heavily on glucose rather than switching reliably to fat storage or energy. Consistency is like training the body to expect periods of fasting and feeding, which eventually allows it to mobilize stored fat without resistance. Fat loss becomes especially predictable when eating frequency is stable. Frequent snacking keeps insulin elevated and prevents fat burning. But people often struggle to stop snacking because they change their routine too abruptly or inconsistently. If one day they avoid snacks, but the next day they give in, the body never fully transitions. The metabolic flexibility needed for smooth fat loss comes from repeating the same fasting and feeding structure long enough for insulin levels to drop consistently. Once the pattern becomes familiar, the body adapts, cravings diminish, and fat becomes a primary energy source between meals. Without consistency, this shift never fully happens, and fat loss feels stalled. Consistency also plays a powerful psychological role. When someone commits to a stable routine, decision fatigue decreases. Instead of constantly negotiating with themselves, should I eat now? Should I break my fast early? Should I have the snack? The person frees themselves from daily internal debate. A predictable plan removes friction and mental load, lowering stress and reducing emotional eating. This mental clarity reinforces the biological benefits of routine, creating a feedback loop where consistency strengthens discipline and discipline reinforces consistency. Many people underestimate how much the body resists constant change. When schedules shift dramatically, sleep changes frequently, or eating habits swing between extremes, the body experiences internal stress. Cortisol rises, appetite increases, and cravings intensify. Even if the person is attempting healthy practices, the inconsistency signals instability to the body. As a result, fat is held tightly as a protective mechanism. But when habits stabilize, the body begins to trust that energy is available in predictable ways. This trust lowers cortisol, improves sleep, balances appetite hormones, and makes fasting or meal timing feel smoother rather than forced. What once felt like discipline eventually becomes normal. The same principle applies to food choices. When the diet swings between clean eating and highly processed foods, the hormonal environment fluctuates. Processed foods spike insulin, alter dopamine pathways, and trigger cravings. Clean eating stabilizes energy and improves fat access. But when these two patterns alternate inconsistently, The body struggles to adapt to either state. A mostly stable diet doesn't have to be perfect, but it builds metabolic momentum. The body becomes more efficient at using fat for fuel. Digestion improves, and the person feels more satisfied with less food. Consistency in the general direction matters more than perfection in every detail. People often assume consistency means strictness, but it doesn't. It means repeating a supportive structure long enough for the body to adapt. It means choosing a fasting window and sticking to it. It means reducing snacking most days of the week. It means allowing the body to understand the pattern so it can regulate hunger, stabilize insulin, and shift into fat-burning mode predictably. Even small inconsistencies are normal. But when the overall structure remains stable over weeks or months, the body aligns with it. The hormonal system becomes calmer, metabolic processes run more smoothly, and fat loss accelerates naturally. The power of consistency becomes especially evident when comparing two people using the same strategy. One person may see rapid progress, while the other struggles, even though their daily choices look similar. The difference often lies in the invisible structure of their habits. One person eats within the same window daily, avoids snacks most days, keeps food quality mostly stable, and maintains predictable routine. The other person does the same strategy, but only intermittently. These small breaks, inconsistencies, and fluctuations prevent the metabolic shift from fully stabilizing. From the outside, both appear equally disciplined, but internally, their hormonal environments are completely different. Once consistency is established, something remarkable happens. Fat loss becomes less emotional. The person stops constantly thinking about food, stops fearing cravings, and stops doubting their method. The journey becomes smoother because the body is no longer resisting. Instead, the body supports the process, mobilizing fat regularly and maintaining stable energy. The person begins to feel in control, not because they are working harder, but because the internal signals have quieted. What once required effort eventually becomes automatic. This is a point where fat loss is no longer a struggle, but a natural outcome of a stable lifestyle pattern.